Michelle Malkin investigates Black Lives Matter in schools.
From violent riots,
Black Lives Matter seem to believe that white police officers just get up in the morning thinking, what black person am I going to shoot today?
to shocking and indiscriminate murders.
They find that hate target is us. The cop is the most visible symbol of government authority, and they're anti-government, anti-authority.
If you listen to the rhetoric and the speeches, ordinary people can get very emotional, get angry, and they assassinate police officers. I'm afraid that that will increase.
So white lives matter now, because now the bullet is going into a white body instead of a typical 18-year-old Crip or Blood or somebody on the corner.
Our nation is under siege. Our cops are in the crosshairs.
Gunfire remained a problem last night, as well as gunfire in the vicinity of officers that were attempting to restrain what disorder did occur.
Teaching people not to respect the police, to hate the police. We're gonna be growing up thinking people like Mike Brown, Eric Garner, and Freddie Gray are icons of the civil rights movement.
And a protest march is no place for a child.
You give a person a microphone, they're likely to be spewing more of the false narratives, more of the hopelessness, more of the victimization that's not going to benefit those young people, and it may actually injure them. No way this would be acceptable for elementary school children.
People who are on stage screaming obscenities, screaming threats. We had the sister of Sylville Smith, the man who was shot and killed by a Milwaukee police officer, the event that sparked the riot, screaming to anybody who would hear, burn the suburbs down.
Next on Michelle Malkin Investigates. Michelle Malkin Investigates. Now, here's Michelle Malkin.
The self-appointed leaders of Black Lives Matter say all they want is for people to know more about the high-profile murders of black men and women at the hands of police officers. And liberal foundations are lining up to pledge support for their cause. The Ford Foundation and Borealis Philanthropy donated $100 million. And George Soros's Open Society Institute kicked in $650,000. But there's a not-so-hidden agenda behind this Marxist-inspired revolutionary war on our peace officers, the only line of defense between criminals and innocent bystanders. Black Lives Matter advocates have been working behind the scenes to push their message onto our children. Teachers around the country are taking it upon themselves to create racist anti-American study materials about Black Lives Matter. And this ideology is being embraced on a state and federal level with our tax dollars on the line. This form of indoctrination will not only create a new generation of anarchists, it poses a real threat to our education system as a whole. ISIS is recruiting and training children to be soldiers, spies, and suicide bombers. Will Black Lives Matter teach our kids to hate and fear law enforcement? Or worse, inspire them to kill? To many Americans, Black Lives Matter is a movement without a clear purpose. Some see it as cutting-edge activism. Others see a hate group using violence to spread fear and uncertainty, demanding policy changes within our government. Followers of the movement are determined to control their message.
How you doing? Who are you guys with? What's that? Who are you guys with?
Dr. Carol Swain is a political science and law professor at Vanderbilt University in Nashville.
Part of the problem with Black Lives Matter and the message that they're sending is that they're not focused on the conditions within the black community, how black people harm each other by their choices, nor are they giving people what they need to overcome their circumstances. You know, America is still a country that has enormous opportunities, that people, can start out poor, they can overcome that poverty. That is not the message of Black Lives Matter. It has nothing to do with empowerment. You go down the list of things that are dysfunctional, that's harming and killing black people, things that black people could actually do something about, that's not part of what they mentioned.
Conservative news radio host Dan O'Donnell rejects the movement's policies and message.
You want to know why Black Lives Matter leaders are so able to stay on message? Because they're able to shout down any opposing message with claims of racism. There's no meaningful debate about either tactics or philosophies. There's no way there can be any sort of real, honest-to-goodness conversation, which is what we're constantly told is the goal here, right? To have a national conversation about issues of race, to have a national conversation about issues of policing, about issues of poverty, about issues of crime, about issues of drug addiction, about issues of inner city decay. Well, okay, if we're going to have that conversation, you can't just sort of end it with, well, you're a racist. That's not how conversations work. That's how bullying works.
To achieve the goals that Black Lives Matter would like to achieve, you would have to totally dismantle and overthrow the U.S. system of government as we know it today. And so, if you have people and they're not willing to compromise, they're not willing to work within the structure that we have, then there's going to be a conflict and it will continue to be violent because there's no evidence that we're dealing with people that are actually rational, or if we're dealing with one leader that can speak for all of those groups. If you have 68 groups with demands, who's negotiating? Who's going to be at the table?
During the civil rights movement of the 1960s, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s policy of non-confrontation resistance was based on the teachings of Gandhi.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation.
Kwame Leo Lillard is a member of the Nashville Civil Rights Veterans Association.
The 60s civil rights movement had the ethos of we are not going to hurt anybody. The way we dressed at the demonstration, it was specifically to show a contrast between what we knew we would face, with white boys that had on duck-tail haircuts, leather jackets, cigarettes in their ears. We knew we had to present such a stark contrast between our opponents and who we were, that we were playing the role of being almost submissive.
Angela James is a professor of Pan-African Studies at Cal State University, Los Angeles, and co-founder of the LA chapter of Black Lives Matter.
It is not the case that we were in the dark old bad times and now we're in the better times, and tomorrow we'll be in the even better times. History reflects a series of protests and retrenchments, resistance and oppression. And I think that we emerge from the world with this notion of the bad old days and increasing progress, and that's done something to us ideologically that needs to be undone, frankly.
But unlike Dr. King's guiding principles of passive resistance, today's movement is intent on provoking police and crying wolf. Milwaukee County Sheriff David Clark is one of the strongest black law enforcement opponents of Black Lives Matter.
This new manifesto that Black Lives Matter has recently put out that has very little to do with the plight of black people in America today. So what it tells me is that we've come so far since the 1960s that now that we're into the 21st century and over a decade in, I mean, Black Lives Matter is scraping the bottom of the barrel to come up with something that they think is a civil rights issue.
I went to a website about Black Lives Matter, and I was shocked by what I found because it was all this Marxist language, and very little about the real conditions of African Americans.
If they keep up this tack, these demands that they're making now, this whole thing might start to unravel. And what I mean by that is even black people are going to look and say, hey, what are you talking about? It's not what we're talking about.
When I started digging into who founded the organization and where it was getting its money from, it was pretty clear that this is not, about empowering black people in communities. This is part of a larger agenda to disrupt the U.S. government.
If you go back to the civil rights struggles of the 1950s and 1960s, the United States still had a lot of issues they had to deal with as it related to racial equality, but it was centered around things like voting rights, colored-only eating counters, drinking fountains, so on and so forth. Those were real issues that this country had to resolve.
This has almost nothing to do with the civil rights movement of the 1960s. In terms of the objectives, in terms of the stated mission, and in terms of, quite frankly, the tactics that are being used. Here in Milwaukee, what started as the protest over an officer-involved shooting death very quickly, and I mean within a matter of minutes, turned into a brick being thrown through a police car and then all hell breaking loose. Buildings burning, violent confrontations with police officers, things being thrown at police officers.
Just the name itself, that Black Lives Matter, the phrase, suggests racial superiority, as if those lives are more important than anybody else's life.
The reality is, this allegedly new civil rights movement was founded on the radical principles of a much more menacing 1960s organization, the nationalist extremist group known as the Black Panther Party. The Panthers promoted the use of violence and guerrilla tactics to overthrow the U.S. government.
I say violence is necessary. Violence is a part of America's culture. It is as American as cherry pie.
The Black Panthers were about local control. And I think that's why they armed themselves, because they said, in order to control our community, we got to protect our community, which is ironic, because all Americans believe in protecting themselves. So the Black Panthers said, I want to protect myself. So now the Black Lives Matter is saying, not to protect ourselves, we want to protect ourselves and people who are supposed to protect us.
The police use of force is one of those things that they can galvanize people around. They know that Black Panthers were a radical movement. Black Lives Matter movement, because the anarchists know this, they know they got to stay away from that because they won't get any acceptance or any sympathy from the population at large, and so they're trying to make this about race and inequality.
There are consequences to constantly calling police officers murderers. And a logical outgrowth of that is that some people somewhere are going to grow up thinking that they have to stop the murderers at any and all cost.
When I think about Black Lives Matter and the tactics that they're using and the results of some of their activities, I do think about the Black Panther Party as well as the Weather Underground and some of those other more extremist groups of the 1960s that were really, using their Marxist strategies to try to overthrow a government. I think that they're the same group in many ways.
While the Panthers failed to achieve their ultimate goals, Black Lives Matter has taken its radicalized message from the streets to the classrooms. And Teach for America, the country's most controversial education group, has pledged allegiance to the movement. The organization gets millions in federal subsidies and has long been suspect for its failure to adequately train recruits to work in inner-city schools.
I feel like Teach for America, it has generated a lot of controversy, and people are looking at the funding and how the teachers are being taught and what they actually bring to the classroom, how they're being supervised. And I believe that to the extent that they receive federal funds, there has to be some monitoring, there has to be some criteria, there has to be some oversight. Like any organization, Teach for America is very much influenced by its leadership. That leadership changes. If you get leadership that's more radical, then you're going to get a message that's going to be more radical than what it has been in the past.
So how do you take that good intention, bright-eyed white kid, and make them a good teacher? You can't just turn them loose in the school. You can't just say, oh, you're going to do 2 years in this school, and we're glad you're here, because they have this cultural gap that they don't understand. It's not their fault. It's Teach for America who thinks that I can just send these white kids in these communities, and they're going to raise these test scores, raise these reading levels, and make these kids aware of the country in which they live in. That doesn't happen. It hasn't happened, and it won't happen.
Black Lives Matter leaders Brittany Packnett, the executive director of Teach for America St. Louis, and alumni DeRay McKesson, one of the movement's most visible and vocal voices, have formed a partnership between their group and the powerful nonprofit.
You have the college students that are participating going into Teach for America, and so they're hearing whatever narrative that they were pretty much indoctrinated with, they're carrying that into the classroom. And they take with them, what they have learned. And so much of what's being taught on college and university campuses, is total Marxism, the political correctness. And I'm not surprised that you would find Black Lives Matter having an influence in the elementary schools.
This alliance could turn elementary and secondary school classrooms into breeding grounds for reactionary racist ideology.
When we talk about state violence, it doesn't come down to individual people and their intent as much as a systemic issue and concerns about the way a system is working. But I don't think that Teach for America is the way to do it.
Just adopting Black Lives Matter curriculum and saying, look what we're doing, we're really going to teach these black kids how to be black? How they can do that? That's not possible. Because it becomes a money game then. How much money can I get out of the federal government? The more money I can get, the more teachers I can get, the more assignments I can get, the more money the administrators get. So there's no incentive to really control the quality and the delivery of the educational achievement of those children.
Young people fresh out of college may not know how to teach. Having young people fresh out of college go to some of the areas in schools where the need for skilled teaching is most dramatic is actually pretty troubling. It sounds lovely, but I find it a very problematic program. And to be honest, I think that is in part a devaluation of what teaching does and what teachers do.
And that may be what's happening now with Teach for America being involved in so many activities related to Black Lives Matter. I think that Black Lives Matter is a movement that people are afraid to question, especially if they're white, to raise any kind of questions about it, because there's always that fear that you're going to be called a racist. And I tell people all the time, you're going to be called a racist anyway if you're white, and so you might as well speak your mind.
When we return, Black Lives Matter infiltrates our public school systems. Are parents helpless to stop the invasion?
These kids are going to be the foot soldiers for the progressive movement. They're being exploited, they're being used. And the stuff they're teaching now is way out of the mainstream. Hating the police. No respect for authority. That's a big one. Out of this progressive leftist ideology. No respect for authority.
So how this can work for other governments is that they're just going to do this, not tell anybody, and then when somebody happens to notice what they're spending money on, accuse the critics of that spending of being racist.
Next, Black Lives Matter organizers are stealing money directly from our state's education budgets around the country. Are we helpless to stop the onslaught? When we come back.
The United States of America is great not because of government, not because of social engineering, not because of politicians and bureaucrats and redistribution of wealth, because of you. You want to talk about blood on hands and violence, pal? Then let's talk about it. But right now, you're making an ass out of yourself. Of course Russia's behind it. They hacked into the Pentagon, they've hacked into the State Department, they've hacked into the Office of Personnel Management, they're hacking throughout our government. Tip! His father said, I think my son's a terrorist. That's a pretty damn good tip.
As Black Lives Matter chapters expand their operations across the country, polarizing our population, it's impossible to avoid the momentum of the left. Black Lives Matter has successfully created the false hands up, don't shoot narrative about race relations in America, manipulated the truth, fomented hate, instigated violence, and the biased liberal media has embraced the cause without question. The radical revolutionaries have seized the moment, stifled dissent, and spread their message from the working class neighborhoods of Ferguson and Baltimore to college campuses and public schools. From San Francisco, St. Paul, and Chicago to smaller cities like Charleston, West Virginia, and Durham, North Carolina, teachers are taking it upon themselves to force Black Lives Matter on our easily influenced and impressionable children. And now, part 2 of our investigation. Across the Middle East, a new kind of terror campaign has been unleashed on innocent civilians. ISIS is enlisting children as young as 8 years old as soldiers and suicide bombers. Children have been involved in military and propaganda campaigns for centuries, and on a global scale. Could our kids be used as pawns in the unpredictable wave of violence that is sweeping our country?
What do you think it would do to an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old, or even younger, a 6-year-old, to be constantly told that police officers are, quote, killing us? That for no other reason than a racist grudge, police officers are targeting African Americans, particularly young African American men. Of course it's gonna make them angry at police officers.
These kids that were involved in that, they don't process things like that. What we're talking about is culturally dysfunctional underclass behavior. They're reacting to circumstances. They're reacting to Ferguson. They're reacting to, Freddie Gray. They're reacting to the stuff they're seeing on TV, and they're just reacting to circumstances.
They're gonna think, oh my goodness, I have to do something about this. They're targeting my community. They're targeting my family. They could target me next. I have to protect my community. I have to protect my family. I have to protect myself.
Black Lives Matter has been creating a real sense of fear, not only within the law enforcement community, but the general population as a whole.
The way people communicate today is so different. During the era of the civil rights movement, there was a lot of communication, but you did it the old-fashioned way. You either picked up a phone, or you sent a letter, or just some other form of communication. But now with Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, it's much easier to organize a protest.
There was a video that was captured of a group of African American people beating a white young lady. And one of the attackers screamed, and I quote, "White girl bleed a lot," as a lot of the attackers started laughing. All across the country, we are seeing race-based violence. And the dirty little secret is that the overwhelming majority of these racial attacks, these hate crimes, is that it is black on white.
And so this is the new environment that we live in. There is anger, there's frustration, and it's clearly being stoked by people that have a much larger agenda. And I think the goal is to break down the system, to overwhelm law enforcement, or to intimidate them to the point that they can't, or they don't, or they won't do their jobs. And when the Black Lives Movement talk about taking over the police department and community policing, what does that mean? I'm not sure what that means, especially when you see the level of crime in urban areas.
The lame duck Obama administration refused to label the group a domestic terror organization.
People say Black Lives Matter. The data shows black folks are more vulnerable to these kinds of incidents.
For people that are concerned about Black Lives Matter and whether or not it's actually generating violence, if it's giving young people a message that instead of empowering them, to better themselves, that's actually creating more hopelessness. If the citizens were making the decisions rather than a handful of elites in Washington, you'd get very different outcomes. But currently, there's the sense that there's nothing you can do about it.
The Black Lives Matter kids do not give a damn about that. They're saying, we're tired. We waited 40 years. When is this thing called equality gonna happen? My grandparents tried that we shall overcome stuff, didn't work. So they're going for broke. They're saying, let's find another way.
With the blessing of the highest office in the land, Black Lives Matter spread its message of fear and hate. And what better place to start than in our public schools? Milwaukee County Sheriff David Clark is an outspoken critic of the Black Lives Matter movement.
These kids are gonna grow up, they're gonna be the foot soldiers for the progressive movement. They're being exploited, they're being used, okay? And the stuff they're teaching now is way out of the mainstream. Hating the police, no respect for authority, that's a big one. Out of this progressive leftist ideology.
But who should be making the decisions to take our kids to demonstrations that could turn violent or be taught that we live in a society ruled by racist cops? Look what happened in Durham, North Carolina. First grade teacher Steph Bernal Martinez, a self-described radical queer progressive, took her class on a field trip to a Black Lives Matter march without notifying parents.
You give a person a microphone, they're likely to be spewing more of the false narratives, more of the hopelessness, more of the victimization that's not going to benefit those young people, and it may actually injure them. It's no way, that this would be acceptable for elementary school children.
But other school systems are following suit. 5 teacher librarians in the San Francisco Unified School District created an online curriculum based on Black Lives Matter without consulting the school board, principals, or parents. And in St. Paul, Minnesota, American Studies professor Duchess Harris authored the textbook Black Lives Matter for elementary school students that turned shooting victims like Trayvon Martin and Freddie Gray into martyrs.
To deny that it's important to introduce notions of inequality, race, and racism to children that are 5, 6, 7, 8 years old is to deny that they are impacted by race and racism.
But what the Black Lives Matter movement has done, especially to impressionable young kids, is to teach them that they don't have to obey the law, because the law is illegitimate. Law enforcement is illegitimate, and that law enforcement is racist against them.
Teaching people to hate the police, that's why I called it a hateful ideology. They're gonna grow up not thinking of people like Rosa Parks, not thinking of people like Frederick Douglass. They're gonna be growing up thinking people like Mike Brown, Eric Garner, and Freddie Gray are icons of the civil rights movement. I mean, this whole thing just blows my mind.
The Black Lives Matter movement is taking its seemingly anti-cop, anti-white message from the street to the classroom. Teachers in elementary and secondary schools around the country are forcing a false narrative on our children. Taking kids to protest marches that could turn violent with only the slightest provocation?
You don't take them to a field trip to a protest when they're in kindergarten. They have no clue. You gotta feed them a little bit at a time. And you gotta start with the fundamental issue of why do we have to change? What are we doing to other people? But you just can't pick them up and take them to a demonstration when they're 4 years old. They won't have an idea what they're doing. Kids wanna play. They don't wanna fight, they don't wanna protest.
Inflammatory textbooks that compare Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King to Michael Brown and Freddie Gray? Whether we like it or not, educators are inspiring a new generation of protesters who will be taught that aggression is the only answer.
The danger is that this sort of radical left-wing, quite frankly hateful ideology could very easily, and far quicker than anyone could imagine, become embedded into the very fabric of education curricula.
In Milwaukee schools, only 26% of students achieved proficiency on the latest Wisconsin English language test, half the statewide average. A measly 16.5% achieved proficiency in math. According to the MacIver Institute, more than 31,500 Milwaukee students attend 55 public schools that failed to meet minimum proficiency standards. So why has the city of Milwaukee squandered its scarce resources on propaganda that labels America a racist, sexist, homophobic police state instead of teaching kids the basics?
Milwaukee is the largest city in Wisconsin, a heavily Democratic state with GOP Governor Scott Walker at the helm. But the city's liberal-leaning school board tried to sneak nearly $500,000 in state funds for a Black Lives Matter-inspired curriculum into the 2017 budget.
You see how the game works here? They secretly stashed this in. Nobody knew about the Black Lives Matter budget initiative until one of my listeners noticed it in a tiny little budget notice that's legally required on page like 15C of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and then called it to my attention.
I would be very concerned about the Milwaukee program where they're using state dollars to bring in a curriculum that would educate young kids about Black Lives Matter. It is something that needs to be debated. I mean, it's not something that you sneak in. It should not be something that goes into the curriculum, that becomes a part of Common Core, that becomes a part of secondary education without enormous oversight.
After a one-sided debate, the school board approved the measure, setting a dangerous precedent for public school systems around the country.
What we saw here in Milwaukee was, without any real debate, without any real opposition, $470,000 goes to the tenets of Black Lives Matter.
No tolerance for anybody else's views. And not only will you be quiet about your view that is not consistent with ours, if you don't promote our view, we'll fire you, we'll discipline you, we'll ostracize you.
They'll shut down debate over legitimate questions about the wisdom of spending this money on left-wing organizations and left-wing ideas by merely accusing anybody who opposes them of being a racist, of being a homophobe, of being a bigot, of being sexist, of being a misogynist, that it effectively chills speech to the point that there is no opposition anymore to the radical left-wing thought that keeps being funded.
Should our kids be taught about Black Lives Matter? And do we have any say in how our state and federal dollars are being spent on this volatile and inflammatory subject matter? Just look at what's happening around the country. In August 2016, a mother of one of the two central Pennsylvania teens charged with shooting at police officers blamed the social justice movement for his actions. In a statement, Luz Rentas wrote that her son and his friend went to jail for doing what Black Lives Matter wanted them to do: shoot at cops. At every turn, critics of the organization are being confronted, fired from jobs, and expelled from schools. In St. Paul, Minnesota, Black Lives Matter organizers threatened to shut down Como High School unless teacher Theo Olson was fired over his Facebook comments criticizing BLM protesters. He was suspended, but the damage was done, and Olson is a marked man. A University of Houston student and vice president of the Student Government Association, Rohini Seth, was punished for writing "All Lives Matter" on her Facebook page after the July 7, 2016 shooting in Dallas that killed 5 police officers. She faced a 50-day suspension, but it was lifted after she was forced to apologize and agree to take a leave of absence for the remainder of the semester. Meanwhile, leaders of Black Lives Matter are expanding their power and presence in your children's classrooms, teaching from textbooks just like this one. Cop-bashing DeRay McKesson, considered one of the movement's principal trailblazers, has ensconced himself in the Baltimore public school system as a cabinet member with a 6-figure salary. His office is responsible for staffing schools and managing a budget of $4 million. If this movement succeeds, there will be more division, more hatred, more bloodshed. Our schools will be converted from centers of learning into factories of cop-hating agitators. And that wraps up our investigation for this edition of MMI. If you've got a story to share, email me at michelle@michellemalkininvestigates.com. On this show, we dig deeper shatter false perceptions, and get answers in the pursuit of justice. On behalf of our entire team, I'm Michelle Malkin. Thanks so much for joining us.
We hope you got more information from this video that is helpful. Right now, there is an increase in violence and division that is enabled by misinformation. In Christ, there is no race and no racism. We are operating in a world, though, that insists we take sides, and sometimes the consequences for our open or tacit endorsement are high. Looking at the facts and root causes of conflicts and unfairness or injustice is especially important when people are using misinformation to excuse violence, government overthrow, destruction, and even death. Because of political agendas, these videos are hard to search for, may get removed or censored. We feel like they are well-sourced, thoughtful, and truthful. We hate racism and injustice towards anyone. What has happened, though, is groups like Black Lives Matter and the political news media have lied about the circumstances and the frequency of police shooting unarmed black men and women. They've also lied about things that have been done to bring justice and remove any law enforcement and imprisonment actions that are needlessly violent, illegal, or reckless. A key influence in our thinking on this is a major prophecy from Brother Kenneth E. Hagin in 1963. It predicted worsening racism that was merged with communism. This is what we are seeing now. Many churches are attempting to appease or justify the violent and deceptive groups that are protesting, rioting, and calling for removing the rule of law. Fighting deception by sharing more lies and playing on people's emotions is more than ineffective. We should be leading our own communities and nations in change and never joining in or endorsing people and groups that are against the family, against the church, and for perversion and unrestricted abortion. The answer is not political, but we use political systems to restrain evil. The real answer that will conquer hate, envy, theft, and violent mob rule is the church. When we are empowered from heaven and equipped with the truth, forgiveness, and the good news that in Christ, we are all one family, we win the hearts and minds of the lost. Go to faithtrainers.com/raising racism for more information, or see the other videos in this collection on the Faith Trainers YouTube channel. Grow fast. Grow strong. Glorify God.